What if the best bowl of pho in the world wasn't created by a famous chef, but by an American farmer who had lost everything? After losing her family farm in Iowa, Sarah Mitchell traveled to Vietnam, hoping to learn one traditional recipe before returning home. But inside a small family-owned pho shop in Hoi An, she discovered a lesson far greater than cooking. What began as a journey for food became a journey that transformed her heart, her future, and the lives of farmers on 2 continents. Gentle monsoon rain drifted across the ancient town of Hoi An, Vietnam. Mist hovered above the Thursday Bon River while the fragrance of cinnamon, star anise, and simmering broth floated quietly through narrow streets lined with golden walls and colorful lanterns. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined that losing everything would one day bring her halfway across the world. At 42, the American farmer from Iowa carried herself with the steady confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime solving problems with her own hands. She stood 5'8" with a strong athletic frame built through years of lifting hay bales, repairing fences, and driving tractors before sunrise. Her shoulder-length blonde hair, faded by countless summers beneath the Midwestern sun, was tied into a simple ponytail. Freckles dusted her weathered face, while her blue eyes reflected equal parts resilience and exhaustion. The rough skin on her hands told the story of 4 generations of farming more honestly than words ever could. The Mitchell family had raised corn on the same Iowa land for over 100 years. Sarah's earliest memories were not of birthdays or vacations, but of planting seeds beside her father, watching thunderstorms roll across endless fields, and listening to her grandfather explain that every harvest depended on respecting the soil long before expecting anything in return. For years, she believed hard work would always be enough. Then the weather changed. Seasons of severe drought were followed by violent storms. Crop prices continued falling while fertilizer, fuel, and equipment costs climbed higher every year. Bank loans that once seemed manageable slowly became impossible to repay. Sarah fought for nearly 6 years to keep the farm alive. She sold machinery, postponed repairs, worked second jobs during winter, and refused to give up even when neighbors quietly admitted defeat. But determination could not change mathematics. On a cold November afternoon, she signed the papers that transferred most of the Mitchell farm to the bank. Watching strangers drive across fields her family had cultivated for generations felt like losing a member of the family. When she packed the last box from the farmhouse, the silence seemed louder than any storm she had ever survived. For months afterward, Sarah drifted through life without direction. She worked temporary jobs, avoided conversations about farming, and could no longer bring herself to drive past fields of corn. The profession she had loved since childhood now reminded her only of failure. One rainy evening, unable to sleep, she switched on the television and discovered a documentary about traditional Vietnamese pho. The program showed an elderly woman rising before dawn, carefully choosing herbs from local farmers before returning to a tiny kitchen where a single pot of broth simmered for hours. Near the end of the documentary, the narrator asked what made her pho so special. The elderly cook smiled gently before answering. A great bowl of pho always begins with respect for the farmer. Sarah replayed those words 3 times. Nobody in America had spoken about farmers with that kind of gratitude in years. Something deep inside her stirred. She wasn't searching for another recipe. She was searching for a reason to believe that the work of people who grew food still mattered. 2 weeks later, carrying only one suitcase and a notebook, Sarah boarded a flight to Vietnam. Friends thought she was running away from heartbreak. Sarah wasn't sure they were wrong. When she arrived in Hoi An, everything felt unfamiliar. Scooters flowed quietly through narrow streets, bicycles leaned against ancient walls, and market stalls overflowed with herbs she had never seen before. Yet despite the differences, she noticed something comforting. Everywhere she looked, people spoke about ingredients with the same affection her grandfather had once reserved for healthy soil. Over the next several days, Sarah tasted pho from restaurants across the old town. Every bowl seemed different. Some carried a sweeter aroma, others a richer broth or brighter herbs. Whenever she asked local residents where she should learn, they all gave the same answer. You should find Mrs. Lawn. The small restaurant was almost hidden down a quiet alley. There were no bright signs, no long menu, and no advertisements. Customers arrived before sunrise, ate quietly, thanked the owner, and left with satisfied smiles. Behind the steaming pot stood Nguyen. She was 74 years old, small in stature but remarkably graceful. Her silver hair was gathered neatly into a low bun, and years of waking before dawn had left gentle lines across her warm brown face. Her eyes were calm, observant, and filled with a kindness that seemed to put everyone around her at ease. Though widowed many years earlier, she continued preparing no more than 40 bowls of pho each morning because she believed quality should never be sacrificed for profit. Every movement she made was slow, precise, and practiced through decades of quiet dedication. Sarah waited until the last customer finished breakfast. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "My name is Sarah," she said. "I came from Iowa. I used to be a farmer. And I came to Vietnam because I want to learn how to cook pho." Lon listened without interrupting. "I'll work for free," Sarah continued. "I'll clean, carry water, wash dishes, whatever you need. I only want the chance to learn." For several long moments, the elderly woman simply looked at her. Then a gentle smile appeared. She slowly shook her head. "No, nothing more. No explanation. Only one quiet word that left Sarah standing alone beneath the soft rain, wondering whether her journey had ended before it had truly begun. Before dawn each morning, soft rain continued to fall over Hoi An. The lanterns still glowed faintly above the empty streets while the scent of damp earth mixed with fresh herbs drifting in from the countryside. Sarah Mitchell returned to Nguyen Land's small pho shop the next morning despite the rejection. She arrived before 4 o'clock, expecting to hear no once again. Instead, she found Lon quietly loading empty woven baskets onto an old motorbike parked beside the restaurant. The elderly woman glanced at Sarah, then silently handed her one of the baskets. "No talking," Lon said gently. "Come." That single word was the closest thing to an invitation Sarah had received. They rode through narrow village roads where rice paddies shimmered beneath the early rain. The farther they traveled from the ancient town, the more Sarah felt as though she had stepped into another world. Roosters crowed behind bamboo fences, farmers walked through muddy paths carrying shoulder poles, and small vegetable gardens stretched between quiet homes surrounded by banana trees. Their first stop was a modest herb farm beside the Thursday Bond River. Waiting there was Tran Min, a 58-year-old farmer whose family had grown herbs for 3 generations. Min was lean and sun-darkened from decades beneath Vietnam's tropical sky. Short black hair streaked with silver framed a weathered but gentle face, while his warm brown eyes revealed a patient nature that years of floods and difficult harvests had never managed to erase. His hands were rough with calluses, yet he picked each herb as carefully as though it were something precious. Lon greeted him like an old friend. "How is your wife feeling?" "Better," Min answered with a grateful smile. "Thank you for asking." They spoke briefly before walking into the herb beds. Sarah expected Lon to bargain over prices. Instead, she watched something entirely different. Lon gently touched the leaves, smelled handfuls of Thai basil, examined young coriander, and carefully selected bunches of sawtooth herb. She asked when each section had been planted, how much rain had fallen during the previous week, and whether insects had damaged any of the crops. To Sarah's surprise, Min answered every question with pride rather than impatience. As they continued their journey, they visited another family growing ginger beneath tall areca palms. Then they stopped at a small hillside where fragrant cinnamon trees had been cultivated for decades. Every farmer welcomed Lon with the same warmth. She remembered birthdays, grandchildren, illnesses, and even which fields had suffered from storms the previous year. Sarah listened more than she spoke. Back in Iowa, she had always known her neighboring farmers. Yet she had never imagined a cook could know the people behind every ingredient so intimately. Later that morning, Lon purchased beef bones from a small cattle farm outside town. Before agreeing to buy them, she carefully asked about the animals' age, their feed, and how they had been raised. Sarah finally could not contain her curiosity. "You know everyone," she said. Lon smiled. "I should. They're your suppliers?" Lon slowly shook her head. "They're my partners." The words lingered in Sarah's mind for the rest of the day. When they returned to the restaurant, Sarah instinctively moved toward the large steaming pot of broth. Lon gently raised a hand. "Not yet." Instead, she handed Sarah a basin filled with muddy herbs. For hours, Sarah washed vegetables, trimmed roots, cleaned baskets, peeled onions, sorted cinnamon bark, and swept the kitchen floor. Customers came and went, praising the rich aroma of the pho, but Sarah never touched the broth. As the final bowl was served and the shop grew quiet, Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask, "When will you teach me your recipe?" Lon slowly arranged the remaining herbs into neat bundles before answering. "If I teach you the recipe today," she said softly, "you might learn how to cook." She paused and looked toward the empty baskets that only hours earlier had been filled by local farmers. "But if you first learn where every ingredient comes from, who grew it, who cared for it, and what it cost them to bring it here," her gentle smile returned, "then every bowl you make will carry gratitude instead of pride." Sarah stood silently beside the old wooden table. For the first time since leaving Iowa, she understood that this journey had never been about mastering a famous Vietnamese dish. It was about learning to honor the people whose unseen labor made every meal possible. The warm breath of early summer settled over Hoi, and as gentle rain faded into soft morning mist. Long before sunrise, the old pho shop glowed quietly beneath hanging lanterns while the rich aroma of simmering broth drifted through the empty streets. Nearly 2 months had passed since Sarah Mitchell first walked through the restaurant's narrow doorway asking to become Nguyen Thi Lan's student. Every morning had followed the same rhythm. She rode beside Lon to visit farmers before dawn, carried baskets filled with herbs through muddy fields, washed vegetables until her fingers wrinkled, peeled onions, cleaned beef bones, swept floors, and prepared every ingredient except the one she had traveled across the world to learn. Not once had she complained. She no longer counted how many hours she worked without touching the broth. Instead, she began noticing details she would have ignored only weeks earlier. She could recognize Thai basil by its fragrance before seeing it. She knew which ginger came from sandy soil and which had grown beneath heavier clay. She even noticed that onions harvested after a cool night released a sweeter aroma when sliced. Without realizing it, the farmer inside her had begun speaking the same language as the cook. One rainy morning, Sarah arrived before Lon as usual and quietly prepared the kitchen. She arranged herbs exactly as Lon preferred, checked every basket, and lit the charcoal stove without being asked. When Lon entered a few minutes later, she watched silently. Then the elderly woman walked toward the great steaming pot that had remained beyond Sarah's reach for weeks. She lifted the heavy lid. Fragrant steam filled the room. "Sarah," Lon said, "come here." Sarah hesitated. Lon handed her a long wooden ladle polished smooth by decades of use. "Today," she whispered, "you may stand beside the broth." Sarah accepted it with both hands as though receiving something sacred. The broth shimmered gently beneath the morning light. She leaned closer and closed her eyes for a moment. Immediately, she recognized familiar scents. The sweetness of onions harvested from Min's eastern field. The warmth of cinnamon bark gathered from the hillside after spring rain. The deeper fragrance of older ginger selected only days before. The freshness of herbs picked before sunrise. For the first time, Sarah understood that the broth was not created inside this kitchen. It had begun weeks earlier in gardens, fields, cattle farms, and orchards cared for by people whose names she now knew. Lon watched quietly. "What do you smell?" she asked. Sarah smiled softly. "I smell families." The elderly woman nodded with quiet satisfaction. Now Sarah understood. Recipes could be copied. Respect could not. That afternoon, after the lunch service ended, a visitor stopped outside the restaurant carrying a compact camera and a travel backpack. His name was Alex Rivera, a 30-year-old American travel filmmaker known for documenting traditional food cultures rather than luxury destinations. Alex stood about 5 feet 10 with an athletic build shaped by years of backpacking across Asia. His short black hair curled slightly in the humid air, and his warm brown eyes reflected genuine curiosity instead of the hurried excitement common among online influencers. Friendly and patient, he preferred listening before asking questions, believing every meaningful story belonged first to the people living it. He noticed Sarah speaking English with several local farmers while helping carry baskets into the restaurant. Curious, he asked one of the customers who she was. "The American farmer," the man replied with a smile. "She's here learning much more than pho." With Lan's permission, Alex quietly filmed without interrupting the day's work. His camera captured Sarah greeting farmers by name, carefully washing herbs, thanking every supplier, and finally standing beside the steaming broth with a look of gratitude rather than pride. Before leaving, Alex asked her one simple question. What brought you all the way from Iowa to this little shop in Hoyen? Sarah looked toward Lon, then toward the baskets of fresh herbs waiting beside the kitchen door. She smiled. I didn't come to Vietnam to learn how to cook pho, she said. I came to learn how to respect food. Alex lowered his camera for a moment. He knew he had just heard the sentence that would become the heart of his film. A week later, after returning home, he uploaded the documentary. Neither Sarah nor Lon expected anyone outside their small corner of Hoi to notice. By the end of the first weekend, people from around the world had already begun sharing it. The first autumn rains arrived gently over Hoi, leaving the ancient streets shining beneath colorful lanterns while the fragrance of pho continued drifting through the cool morning air. Inside the little restaurant, everything appeared exactly the same. The broth simmered quietly before dawn, herbs were arranged with patient hands, and only 40 bowls would be served before the doors closed. Outside, however, everything had changed. Within weeks, Alex Rivera's documentary spread far beyond Vietnam. Millions of viewers watched the story of an American farmer who had crossed the Pacific Ocean believing she was searching for a recipe, only to discover a deeper lesson about gratitude, tradition, and the people who grew the food that sustained every community. News organizations requested interviews. Culinary magazines wrote feature articles. Television crews began appearing outside the tiny pho shop before sunrise. Sarah Mitchell found the attention overwhelming. She had spent most of her life avoiding the spotlight, believing that farmers should be known by the quality of their harvest rather than by their faces. Even now, she politely declined invitations to appear on cooking competitions or endorse commercial products. Whenever reporters asked what secret ingredient had transformed her life, she always answered with the same quiet smile. There isn't one, she would say. Respect isn't an ingredient you can buy. Soon, respected chefs from Japan, France, Australia, Canada, and the United States traveled to Hoi, hoping to taste the famous pho and meet the woman whose story had inspired so many people. They expected complicated techniques or hidden family recipes. Instead, they found Sarah carrying baskets of herbs, greeting farmers by name, and helping wash vegetables before the first customers arrived. Many left with something more valuable than culinary advice. They left with a new appreciation for the people behind every meal. One afternoon, Sarah noticed several young culinary students watching Tran Minh deliver freshly harvested herbs to the restaurant. Rather than rushing to photograph the steaming bowls, they followed Minh into the garden, asking questions about the soil, the seasons, and the careful work required to produce herbs of exceptional quality. Sarah smiled quietly. For the first time, she saw visitors becoming just as interested in the farmers as they were in the food. Even local children began looking at the countryside differently. Schools organized visits to nearby farms, encouraging students to learn where vegetables, herbs, and spices truly came from. Families who had once overlooked small local growers now chose to buy directly from them whenever possible. Without realizing it, the little pho shop had become a place where people learned not only about Vietnamese cuisine, but also about gratitude. Despite the growing fame, Nguyen Thi Lan refused to expand the business. We still cook 40 bowls, she said one morning while gently placing herbs into serving baskets. Why not serve more? Sarah asked. Lan smiled. If I make more than I can prepare with care, I won't be serving pho anymore. Those words stayed with Sarah long after the morning ended. She finally understood that success was never measured by the number of customers waiting outside the door. It was measured by whether every bowl honored the farmers, the ingredients, and the traditions that made it possible. As another cool rain drifted across the old town, Sarah stood quietly beneath the restaurant's wooden awning watching visitors from around the world arrive with cameras in their hands. She hoped they would leave carrying something far more valuable than photographs. She hoped they would leave with gratitude. 3 years later, the first warm rains of summer returned to Hoi. The ancient streets shimmered beneath colorful lanterns while the familiar fragrance of pho drifted through the old neighborhood just as it had for generations. Yet one quiet corner of the town had become a destination for people from every continent. The little pho shop still opened before sunrise. It still served only 40 bowls each morning. And Sarah Mitchell still arrived long before the first customer. Although she had become known around the world after Alex Rivera's documentary, she refused to let fame change the rhythm of her days. She still greeted Tran Minh with a smile when he delivered fresh herbs before dawn. She still carried baskets of vegetables through the back door, cleaned the kitchen floor after breakfast, and thanked every farmer before accepting a single ingredient. Visitors were often surprised to discover that the American woman whose story had inspired millions spent far more time listening than speaking. One autumn evening, after the final customer had left, Nguyen Thi Lan invited Sarah to sit beside the old wooden table where they had shared countless quiet conversations. Lan's hands had grown weaker over the years, and her silver hair reflected the passing seasons, but the warmth in her brown eyes had never faded. She gently placed a weathered cloth bundle in front of Sarah. Inside rested a small handwritten notebook, its pages softened by decades of use. Sarah carefully opened it. There were recipes. There were notes about broth, herbs, spices, and cooking times. But there were also pages filled with names. Farmers, gardeners, cattle raisers, fishermen, families. Beside each name, Lan had written small memories. Who grew the sweetest basil after heavy rain, whose cinnamon trees survived the strongest storms, who quietly donated vegetables to struggling neighbors without asking for recognition. Sarah looked up, her eyes already filled with tears. "I thought this was your recipe book." Lan smiled gently. "It is." Sarah looked confused. Lan placed her hand softly over the notebook. The recipe was never only about the broth. She paused. It was always about the people. Several months later, Nguyen Thi Lan passed away peacefully, leaving behind no famous restaurant chain, no luxury brand, and no secret formula sold for millions of dollars. She left something far greater. She left a way of living. Sarah chose not to own that legacy. She chose to share it. Working alongside local farmers, culinary schools, and agricultural organizations, she established the Lan Heritage Farm and Pho Exchange, a nonprofit program connecting Vietnamese farmers with growers from Iowa and other farming communities across the United States. Every year, young chefs traveled to Vietnam to learn where great food truly begins, while American farmers came to experience sustainable farming methods, local markets, and the deep respect Vietnamese families held for every harvest. Back in Iowa, Sarah restored a small piece of farmland she had managed to purchase years later. Instead of planting endless rows of corn alone, she cultivated Vietnamese herbs alongside traditional American crops, proving that different cultures could grow together just as naturally as different plants sharing the same soil. Near the entrance to both farms stood identical wooden signs. "The best bowl of pho is grown long before it is cooked." Whenever Sarah read those words, she no longer thought only about Vietnam. She thought about her father, her grandfather, Tran Minh, Mrs. Lan, and every farmer whose quiet work fed people they would never meet. Looking across fields stretching beneath another peaceful sunrise, Sarah finally understood why she had crossed an ocean. She had never come to Vietnam simply to learn how to cook pho. She had come to learn that the greatest ingredient in any meal was gratitude, and that when gratitude is shared, it can nourish hearts, communities, and generations long after the last bowl has been served. Sometimes God doesn't change our lives with great miracles all at once. Sometimes He changes them through a simple meal, a humble teacher, or a journey that opens our hearts. Sarah came to Vietnam looking for a recipe, but God gave her something far greater, a new purpose and a deeper understanding of gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith, kindness, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with peace, love, and hope. Amen.